You're a burden. I sold Dad's company. Good luck paying rent, my son said. I smiled and replied, all right, good luck. When they landed in Paris and checked their bank accounts, I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I was arranging fresh lilies in the crystal vase when I heard Jason's car pull into the driveway. The sound of his BMW's engine always made my stomach tighten these days. He only visited when he needed something, and it had been 3 months since our last conversation. Through the window, I watched him emerge from the driver's seat, adjusting his expensive suit jacket. Amber followed her heels, clicking against the pavement as she smoothed her blonde hair. Even from a distance, I could see the determined set of her jaw. Whatever they were here for, she was the one driving it. The doorbell rang twice, sharp and impatient. I set down the vase and walked slowly to the front door, my heart already preparing for disappointment. When I opened it, Jason barely looked at me. "Mom," he said, curtly stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk." Amber swept past me, her perfume overwhelming in the small entryway. She was carrying a leather briefcase, which she clutched like a weapon. "Hello, Evelyn," she said with that fake sweetness that always made my skin crawl. I led them to the living room, the same one where Jason had taken his first steps 36 years ago. Now he stood in the center of it like a stranger, his arms crossed, looking at everything except me. "Can I get you coffee? I just made a fresh pot," I offered, trying to maintain some normalcy. "This isn't a social visit," Jason said, his voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "Sit down, Mom. There's something you need to know." My legs felt weak as I sank into my favorite armchair, the one Richard and I had picked out together 42 years ago. Amber sat across from me, opening her briefcase with deliberate precision. Jason remained standing, towering over both of us. "The company is sold," he announced as if he were discussing the weather. The words hit me like a physical blow. "What do you mean, sold?" Amber pulled out a thick stack of papers, setting them on the coffee table between us. "The sale went through yesterday morning," she said, her voice businesslike. Jason has been handling all the paperwork for months. I stared at the documents, my vision blurring slightly. The company Richard and I had built from nothing, the one that had provided for our family for decades, was gone. "But I'm still the majority shareholder," I whispered. Jason let out a harsh laugh. "Mom, you haven't been involved in the day-to-day operations for 3 years. Not since Dad died. You don't even understand the financials anymore." "That's not true," I said, but my voice sounded small even to my own ears. "Look at you," Amber interjected, gesturing toward me with manicured nails. "You can barely manage this house. The bills pile up on your kitchen counter for weeks. You forget appointments. Just last month you called Jason 3 times in one day asking about the same thing." Heat rose in my cheeks. It was true that I'd been calling Jason more frequently since Richard's death, but not because I was confused, because I was lonely, because I missed having someone to share decisions with. Jason pulled up a chair directly in front of me, his elbows on his knees. "Mom, you're 66 years old. You've been struggling since Dad passed. The company needs young leadership, fresh ideas. I can't keep watching you run it into the ground. The company is profitable," I said, my voice stronger now. "The quarterly reports show." "The quarterly reports show what Dad set up years ago," Jason interrupted. "But the industry is changing. Technology, automation, digital marketing. You don't understand any of that." Amber nodded sympathetically. "We're not trying to hurt you, Evelyn. We're trying to protect you. The buyer paid well above market value. The money will keep you comfortable for the rest of your life." I looked between them, searching for any sign of the son I'd raised, the boy who used to climb into my lap when thunderstorms scared him. Instead, I saw a man who looked at me with barely concealed impatience. "How much?" I asked quietly. Jason and Amber exchanged a glance. $3.4 million, he said. After taxes and fees, you'll have about $2.3 million in your account by Friday. It was a good price. Better than good, actually. But the money wasn't the point. You sold our company without even asking me. I'm asking you now, Jason said, his tone suggesting the conversation was over. I'm asking you to sign these papers, making it official to acknowledge that the sale was in your best interest. Amber leaned forward, her voice taking on that syrupy quality again. Think about it, Evelyn. No more board meetings, no more worrying about employee problems or market fluctuations. You can focus on what really matters. Your garden, your book club, maybe some travel. Jason stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. When he turned back, his face was hard. The truth is, Mom, you're a burden. You have been ever since Dad died. You call me constantly with questions that any competent business owner should know. You second-guess every decision I make, even though you don't understand the modern marketplace. The word burden hung in the air like smoke from a fire. I felt something inside me crack. Not break exactly, but crack like ice beginning to thaw. I sold Dad's company because it was the right thing to do, Jason continued, his voice rising slightly. For the business, for the employees, and for you. Good luck with the rent on your new apartment, because this house is going to cost more to maintain than you can afford on a fixed income. Amber shot him a warning look, but he ignored it. You're my son, I said softly, more to myself than to him. And you're my mother, he replied, which is why I'm doing this. Someone has to make the hard decisions, and clearly, it's not going to be you. I sat in that chair for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. My mind was strangely calm, like the eye of a hurricane. When I finally looked up, both Jason and Amber were watching me expectantly. Okay, I said simply. Good luck. Jason blinked. What? I said, okay, good luck. I stood up slowly, smoothing my skirt. I assume you'll need me to sign those papers. Where Amber fumbled with the documents, clearly expecting more of a fight. Here, and initial there. I signed where they indicated my handwriting steady, despite the tremor I felt inside. When I finished, I handed the pen back to Amber and walked toward the front door. That's it, Jason called after me. You're not going to argue. Not going to guilt-trip me about family loyalty. I turned back to face him, my hand on the doorknob. Would it change anything? He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I didn't think so, I said. Have a wonderful time in Paris. I hope the weather is nice for your honeymoon. Amber's eyes widened. How did you know about Paris? I smiled for the first time since they'd arrived. I know more than you think I do. After they left, I sat back down in my armchair and looked around the living room. Everything was exactly the same as it had been an hour ago. Yet everything had changed. The silence felt different now. Not lonely, but expectant, like the moment before dawn. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. Thomas, it's Evelyn. I think it's time we had that conversation. Thomas arrived within the hour, carrying the same worn leather satchel he'd been using since I first met him 25 years ago. My longtime attorney, and more importantly my friend, looked exactly as I expected him to, concerned but not surprised. I take it Jason went through with it, he said, settling into Richard's old chair without ceremony. Every word exactly as we predicted. I poured him coffee from the pot I'd made earlier, my hands steadier now than they'd been in months. He called me a burden, Thomas. His exact words. Thomas shook his head, his gray eyebrows knitting together. I'm sorry, Evelyn. I know we prepared for this, but it still must have hurt. I sat across from him, cradling my own cup. The hurt stopped surprising me years ago. What surprises me is how predictable he's become. Shall we review the timeline? Thomas asked, pulling out a thick folder from his satchel. I nodded, though I knew every detail by heart. We'd been planning this for 3 years, ever since Richard's funeral, when Jason had pulled me aside and suggested I might want to simplify my business responsibilities. It started in 1985. I began my voice taking on the cadence of a story I'd told many times. Richard and I were both 25, fresh out of college, and completely broke. I had a business degree and a head full of ideas. He had charisma and the ability to charm investors. Thomas smiled. The classic combination, except everyone assumed Richard was the brains of the operation. I set down my coffee cup with a soft clink. The bank loans were approved because of his charm. The early partnerships happened because men in the 80s were more comfortable dealing with other men. So, we played the game. I walked to the mahogany desk in the corner, pulling out a framed photograph from the bottom drawer. It showed Richard and me at the ribbon cutting for our first office building. He was holding the scissors, beaming at the camera. I was standing slightly behind him, my hand on his shoulder, smiling, but watching the crowd. I was always watching. I said more to myself than to Thomas. While Richard worked the room, I was calculating who had real influence, who was just talking big, which deals would actually materialize, and the company structure Thomas prompted. Officially, Richard owned 60%, I owned 40%. But the real power was in the subsidiary companies, the holding trusts, the intellectual property rights. All things I set up and managed while Richard focused on the public face of the business. I opened another drawer, this one filled with documents that Jason had never seen. When Jason joined the company 8 years ago, Richard was already showing signs of his heart condition. We knew we needed to plan for succession. Thomas pulled out his reading glasses. That's when you established the Hamilton Trust. Exactly. I felt a familiar satisfaction remembering how carefully we'd constructed it. 75% of the company's actual value, the patents, the international contracts, the commercial real estate holdings was transferred to a trust with me as the sole beneficiary. The remaining 25%, which included the day-to-day operations and the company name, stayed in the traditional corporate structure. And Jason knew none of this. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Jason knew what he wanted to know. He was so eager to prove himself to show that he could run things better than his old-fashioned parents. He never asked the right questions. The afternoon sun was streaming through the windows now, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny secrets. I remembered another afternoon, almost exactly a year ago, when I'd overheard Jason on the phone in Richard's old office. He was talking to Amber. I said the memory's still sharp. She was asking about the company's assets, about whether I had any real control over the finances. Jason laughed and said I was just a figurehead, that I'd never understood the business side of things. Anyway, Thomas made a note on his legal pad. That's when you decided to accelerate the timeline. That's when I realized my son had never really known me at all. I returned to my chair, feeling the weight of decades settling around me. For 36 years, I've been the woman behind the curtain. I've let Richard take credit for my ideas. Let Jason believe I was just his scatterbrained mother who needed protection. Why, Thomas asked gently. It was a question he'd posed many times over the years. Because I thought it was what they needed from me. I traced the rim of my coffee cup with my finger. Richard needed to feel like the success was his. His pride required it. And Jason needed to believe he was rescuing me from my own incompetence. It gave him purpose. But Richard knew the truth. Richard knew. My voice softened, especially at the end. The night before he died, he made me promise something. He said, "Don't let Jason take advantage of your kindness the way I did. Make sure he learns what you're really worth." Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying me with the look of someone who'd known me long enough to read between the lines. And now Jason has sold what he thinks is our entire company for $3.4 million. I smiled, and this time there was definitely humor in it. What he doesn't know is that he sold about 25% of the actual value the shell, you might say. The Hamilton Trust holdings are worth, as of yesterday's valuation, approximately $11 million. I pulled out a financial statement from the desk drawer. The patents alone are worth $5 million. The commercial properties we own in Chicago and San Diego are worth another $4.2 million. The international distribution rights account for the rest. Thomas whistled low. And Jason has no idea. Jason has spent the last 3 years telling me I don't understand modern business. He's probably right. I don't understand why you'd sell a profitable company without doing due diligence on its actual assets. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden Richard and I had planted together. Do you know what Jason said to me last Christmas? He said I was living in the past, that I needed to accept that the business world had moved beyond what a woman of my generation could understand. What did you tell him? I told him he was probably right. I turned back to Thomas, and then I made 3 new international deals and increased our patent portfolio by 45%. Thomas closed his folder and leaned forward. So, what happens now? Now we wait for Jason and Amber to arrive in Paris. They're staying at the Hotel Le Bristol, the presidential suite. I booked it for them myself as a wedding gift, using company funds that no longer exist, using funds from an account that Jason thinks contains his inheritance money. I felt a small flutter of anticipation in my chest. The account that will show a zero balance when they try to access it tomorrow morning. And the 60 calls I laughed, the sound echoing in the quiet room. That's just an estimate. Knowing Jason, it might be more. Thomas packed his papers back into his satchel, but he didn't stand to leave. Evelyn, are you sure about this? Once this plays out, there's no going back with Jason? I considered his question. Really considered it. Was I sure? Was I ready to lose my son completely in order to teach him who I really was? Thomas, I said finally, I lost my son the day he decided I was a burden. Everything that happens now is just me getting my dignity back. After Thomas left, I sat alone in the house that suddenly felt more like home than it had in years. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Linda. It's Evelyn. Yes, I know it's been a while. Listen, I have a proposition for you. How would you feel about running a company again? As I talked outlining my plans for expanding the business, Jason had just unknowingly signed away. I realized something had shifted inside me. For the first time since Richard's death, I felt like myself again, the real me. The woman who'd built an empire while everyone thought she was just serving coffee and keeping the books. Tomorrow, Jason would learn the difference. Whether he could handle the truth remained to be seen. The first call came at exactly 9:47 a.m. Paris time, which was 2:47 a.m., where I was sitting in my kitchen, wide awake, with a cup of chamomile tea. I'd been counting down the hours, knowing that Jason and Amber would try to access their funds first thing in the morning after their arrival. I let it ring. The second call came 3 minutes later, then another. By the 5th call, my phone was vibrating so aggressively on the kitchen table that it nearly fell to the floor. I picked it up on the 6th ring. Hello, Jason. Mom. His voice was strained. Panic barely contained beneath a thin veneer of control. There's a problem with the bank accounts, some kind of technical issue. The funds from the sale aren't showing up. I took a slow sip of my tea. That's strange. Have you called the bank? Of course I called the bank. The veneer was already cracking. They said the account was closed yesterday afternoon. Closed, Mom? How does an account just close itself? I wouldn't know, dear. Banking isn't really my area of expertise, as you've reminded me many times. There was a pause, and I could hear Amber's voice in the background, sharp and demanding. Jason covered the phone, but I could still make out her words. Tell her to fix it. Now, Mom, Jason's voice was back more controlled, but with an edge I'd never heard before. I need you to call Thomas. There's obviously been some kind of mistake with the paperwork. The sale money should have been deposited yesterday. I'll call him in the morning, I said pleasantly. It's nearly 3:00 a.m. here, Jason. I'm sure whatever it is can wait until business hours. No, it can't wait. The control snapped completely. We're in Paris, Mom. We have reservations plans. I paid for a suite at one of the most expensive hotels in Europe. Our cards aren't working either. I made a sympathetic clicking sound with my tongue. That does sound inconvenient. I hope you brought some cash for emergencies. The line went quiet except for the sound of Jason's breathing, which was becoming increasingly ragged. When he spoke again, his voice was dangerously low. Mom, I'm going to ask you once more, and I need you to listen very carefully. Call Thomas right now and find out where our money is. Our money? I repeated the phrase, slowly tasting each word. I wasn't aware that you and I had any joint accounts, Jason. The money from the sale, my inheritance, the $3.4 million that should be in my account right now. I set down my teacup with deliberate care. Oh, that money. Yes, I know exactly where that is. Thank God I heard him exhale. So call Thomas, and it's in my account, I said simply. The silence that followed was so complete, I wondered if the call had dropped. Then Jason's voice came back barely above a whisper. What did you say? I said the money is in my account, where it's always been, where it will stay. The explosion was immediate. What the hell are you talking about? I sold the company. I have the paperwork. You signed it yourself? Yes, you did sell the company. And yes, I did sign the papers. You sold 25% of Harrison Industries for $3.4 million. Quite a good price for what you actually owned, all things considered. I could hear Amber now, her voice getting closer to the phone. What is she saying? Jason, what is she talking about, Mom? Jason's voice was shaking now. Whether from rage or fear, I couldn't tell. Stop playing games. You can't do this. The company was Dad's. It's mine now. The company name was your father's. Yes, and the daily operations, the employee payroll, the office lease in downtown Denver, all of that was yours to sell. And you did. Congratulations. Then where? His voice cut off abruptly, and I knew he was beginning to understand. Where are the assets I finished for him? The patents, the international contracts, the commercial real estate, the manufacturing rights. Those were never part of what you inherited, dear. Those were always mine. The phone clattered, and I heard Amber's voice clearly now. Give me that phone. Mrs. Holloway, this is Amber. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Hello, Amber. How's the weather in Paris? Never mind the weather. Jason is telling me you're claiming ownership of assets that rightfully belong to him. That's not legally possible. I've seen the incorporation papers. You've seen some incorporation papers, I corrected. The ones Jason wanted you to see. Tell me, did you happen to review the Hamilton Trust documents? Or the Harrison Holdings subsidiary? Or perhaps the intellectual property assignments filed with the state of Nevada? The silence told me everything I needed to know. I didn't think so. I continued. You see, Amber, when you spend 42 years building a business, you learn to protect your interests. You learn that sometimes the most important assets are the ones that aren't written on the letterhead. Jason's voice came back on the line, and now there was definitely fear there. Mom, you can't do this. I'm your son. We're family. Yes, we are family, which is why you felt comfortable calling me a burden and selling what you thought was my life's work, without even consulting me. I stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the window, looking out at the sunrise beginning to paint the sky pink. Tell me, Jason, did you really think I was so senile that I wouldn't know what you were planning? Planning? I wasn't planning anything. I was trying to help you. You were trying to help yourself to what you thought was an easy inheritance. The difference is that you are counting on me being the helpless old woman you've convinced yourself I am. Amber grabbed the phone again. This is elder abuse. We're going to sue you for everything you have. I laughed a genuine sound of amusement. With what money, dear, and which lawyers? The ones you haven't paid yet? Because you're standing in a hotel lobby in Paris without access to funds. We'll figure it out, Jason said. Back on the line now. I'll call everyone I know. I'll call Dad's old business partners. They'll loan me the money to fight this. You mean the business partners whose contracts are now void because the company they partnered with no longer exists in any meaningful form, I asked. Or perhaps you mean the ones who are currently negotiating new, more lucrative deals with Hamilton Trust. The sound that came through the phone was something between a growl and a sob. You planned this. You planned all of this. I prepared for it, I corrected. There's a difference. I hoped you would prove me wrong. I hoped you would show me that you valued our relationship more than you valued what you could take from me. I do value our relationship. No, Jason, you value what you thought our relationship could get you. There's a difference there, too. I heard hotel lobby sounds in the background, voices speaking rapid French and the unmistakable ding of an elevator. They were clearly trying to sort out their situation in public, which couldn't be pleasant. How long have you known? Jason asked quietly. Known what? Known that I was going to sell the company. I considered lying, making it seem like I'd just recently figured it out. But Jason deserved the truth, even if it was going to hurt. 3 years, I said simply. Since the week after your father's funeral, when you told me I should probably start thinking about simplifying my business responsibilities. 3 years? He repeated numbly. 3 years of watching you circle like a vulture waiting for the right moment to convince me I was incompetent. 3 years of listening to you and Amber whisper about my memory, my capabilities, my age. 3 years of preparing for this exact conversation. Amber's voice was back shrill now with panic. We can't stay here without money. Do you understand that? We're going to be thrown out of this hotel. I'm sure you'll figure something out, I said. You're both so much more capable than I am, after all. Surely a little problem like being stranded in Europe without funds is nothing for people with your business acumen. Mom, please. Jason's voice broke on the word. I made a mistake. I see that now. Just tell me what I have to do to fix this. For a moment, just a moment, I felt the old familiar tug of maternal instinct, the desire to rescue him, to make everything better, to be the mother who solved all his problems. But then I remembered sitting in my living room yesterday, listening to him call me a burden. You can start by figuring out how to get home from Paris without my help, I said. Consider it a learning experience in problem solving. You can't just abandon us here. I'm not abandoning you, Jason. I'm letting you experience what independence feels like. Isn't that what you wanted, to be free of your burden of a mother? The phone went quiet, except for the sound of Jason's breathing. When he spoke again, his voice was small, defeated. What happens now? Now you learn what I've always known. I said, watching the sunrise paint the world in shades of gold. That family isn't just about blood. It's about respect. And respect isn't something you inherit, Jason. It's something you earn. I hung up the phone and turned off the ringer. According to my count, that had been call number 13. If my estimates were correct, I had 40 more to go. I made myself a fresh cup of tea and settled back at the kitchen table with my tablet. I had emails to read, business decisions to make, and a company to run. The real company, the one that had never stopped being mine. Outside, the world was waking up to a beautiful new day. By noon, my phone had recorded 37 missed calls. I'd turned the ringer back on around 10:00 a.m., curious to hear how the tone of Jason's messages would evolve as his situation became more desperate. I wasn't disappointed. The messages progressed from confused to angry to pleading to threatening and back to pleading again. Amber's voice appeared more frequently as the morning wore on her earlier politeness completely abandoned in favor of increasingly shrill demands. I was in my garden pruning the roses Richard had planted for our 20th anniversary when call number 38 came in. This time, I answered on the first ring. "Good afternoon, Jason." "Mom," his voice was now exhausted. "We need to talk. Really talk. I'm listening." "Not on the phone. Face to face. We're coming home." I paused in my pruning, considering this development. "With what money? I believe you mentioned that your cards weren't working." I called Frank. "He's wiring us money for plane tickets." Richard's brother Frank, the one who'd always been jealous of our success. I could only imagine the conversation Jason had with him, probably painting me as a vindictive old woman who'd stolen his rightful inheritance. "That was resourceful of you," I said. "We'll be back tomorrow evening. Will you be home?" "This is my home, Jason. Where else would I be?" The line went quiet for a moment. "Mom, I need you to know that I'm going to fight this legally. I mean, I can't let you destroy Dad's legacy out of spite." "Richard's legacy?" I repeated slowly. "Tell me, Jason, what do you think your father's legacy actually is? The company, the business he built from nothing." "We built from nothing," I corrected. "Your father and I together. But I understand why you'd forget that detail." "Fine, we built. That doesn't change the fact that you're destroying it now." I set down my pruning shears and sat on the garden bench Richard had built for me after my first cancer scare 12 years ago. "I'm not destroying anything, Jason. I'm protecting it." "From who?" "From you." The honesty of my answer seemed to catch him off guard. Several seconds passed before he responded. "From me, Mom. I'm trying to honor Dad's memory. I'm trying to build on what he created. What you're trying to do is cash out as quickly as possible, so you and Amber can live a lifestyle you haven't earned." My voice was calm. "Matter of fact, the buyer you found, Carter Global, they specialize in acquiring companies just to strip their assets and fire their employees." "Did you know that?" Silence. "I thought not." "Did you know that they plan to close our Denver office and move everything to Mexico within 6 months? Did you know that 43 families would have lost their jobs by Christmas?" "That's not." "I didn't. You didn't ask, Jason. You saw a big number in dollar signs, and you didn't ask what would happen to the people your father and I spent 42 years building relationships with." I could hear Amber in the background, her voice urgent but too distant to make out words. "The employees would have found other jobs," Jason said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Diane Cooper has been our office manager for 20 years. She's 58 years old with a high school education. When do you think she'd find another job that pays what we pay her? John Miller has been with us since he was 23. His daughter just started college. How exactly do you think he'd afford tuition after getting laid off?" "Business isn't charity, Mom. Sometimes people get hurt." "You're right. Business isn't charity, but it's not pillaging either. There's a difference between making hard decisions and making selfish ones." The conversation was interrupted by what sounded like an argument in French. "Hotel staff, probably." I could imagine the scene. Jason and Amber standing in an opulent lobby looking increasingly disheveled as they tried to negotiate with people who didn't care about their American entitlement. "We'll be home tomorrow," Jason said finally, "and we'll settle this properly." I look forward to it. After he hung up, I sat in the garden for a long time thinking about the conversation and what would come next. I knew Jason would lawyer up the moment he got back to Denver. I knew he'd try to find some way to challenge the trust structure, to claim I'd manipulated Richard or taken advantage of his illness. What Jason didn't know was that I'd been preparing for that possibility too. I pulled out my phone and called Edward again. "Let me guess," he said before I could speak. They found out about Paris. Call number 38. They're flying back tomorrow on Frank's dime, and Jason's threatening legal action. He thinks he can overturn the trust. Edward chuckled. I assume you're ready for that, too. Pull the video files, I said. All of them. The board meetings, the family dinners, the conversations in Richard's office. If Jason wants to claim I manipulated his father, let's show everyone exactly who was manipulating whom. For the past 3 years, ever since Jason had started making noises about my competence, I'd been recording our interactions. Not secretively exactly, but not obviously either. A small digital recorder in my purse during family dinners, voice memo apps running during phone calls, security cameras in the office that captured more than just break-ins. I'd learned long ago that documentation was protection, especially for women in business, especially for older women in business. How extensive are we talking? Edward asked. Extensive enough. Jason telling Richard that I was getting confused about basic business concepts. Jason suggesting to his father that maybe it was time to transition me into an advisory role only. Jason discussing with Amber how to convince me that selling was in my best interest. And Richard's responses. I smiled, remembering Richard defending me every single time. Richard explaining to Jason that I was the strategic mind behind 90% of our successful deals. Richard telling his son, quote, your mother could run circles around most CEOs half her age, and if you can't see that you're not as smart as I raised you to be. Jason won't be expecting that. Jason's never expected much from me. It's been his greatest weakness. That evening, I made myself a simple dinner and settled in to review the financial reports from our international divisions. Hamilton Trust wasn't just a holding company. It was an actively growing enterprise. While Jason had been focused on the flashy Denver headquarters and the domestic client base, I'd been quietly expanding our reach into markets he'd never even considered. Our partnership with a sustainable manufacturing company in Germany was generating more revenue than our entire Colorado operation. Our licensing deals in Japan had doubled in value over the past 20 months. The software patents we developed for inventory management were being used by companies across 3 continents. Jason thought he'd sold our company for $3.4 million. What he'd actually done was sell the least valuable portion of an empire worth more than $16 million. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. This isn't over. You've made the biggest mistake of your life. Amber apparently had found a way to send international texts. I wondered if she'd borrowed someone's phone, or if she'd convinced Frank to include messaging in his emergency assistance. I typed back, the biggest mistake of my life was letting you into my family. I'm correcting that now. The response came immediately. Jason will never forgive you for this. I stared at that message for a long moment, feeling something settle deep in my chest, something that felt like relief. Good, I typed back. Maybe now we can have an honest relationship. I turned off my phone after that and spent the evening reading. Richard had always said that the best business decisions were made with a clear mind and a calm heart. Tomorrow would bring drama accusations and probably lawyers. Tonight, I wanted to enjoy the peace of a house that finally felt like mine again. Around midnight, I walked through the rooms Richard and I had shared for so many years. The living room, where we'd planned our first expansion. The kitchen, where we'd celebrated our biggest contracts. The office, where we'd worked side by side building something we were proud of. For 3 years, this house had felt like a mausoleum, a shrine to a man who was gone, and a business I thought I'd lost control of. Tonight, it felt alive again. I stopped in front of the family photos lining the hallway, looking at images of Jason as a child, a teenager, a young man just starting his career. In every photo, he was smiling, confident, surrounded by love and support. I'd given him everything I could think of to give him. Education, opportunity, unconditional love, and a path to success. What I'd apparently failed to give him was respect for the people who'd provided all those things. Tomorrow, he'd learn what it felt like to lose them. And maybe if I was very lucky, he'd also learn what it took to earn them back. Jason's rental car pulled into my driveway at 6:55 p.m. the following evening. I'd been watching from the kitchen window, timing their arrival with the same precision I'd once used to schedule international conference calls. They were 12 minutes later than the flight tracking app had predicted, which meant they'd probably argued about something during the drive from the airport. I didn't rush to answer the door when Jason's familiar impatient knock echoed through the house. Instead, I finished washing my dinner dishes, dried my hands carefully, and smoothed my hair before walking slowly to the entryway. Through the frosted glass, I could see two figures standing stiffly on my porch. When I opened the door, the difference in their appearance was startling. Jason's usually immaculate suit was wrinkled from travel. His hair disheveled, and his eyes held a wild, desperate look I'd never seen before. Amber looked even worse. Her makeup was smeared, her designer clothes looked slept in, and she was clutching an oversized purse like a life preserver. "Mom," Jason said, his voice carefully controlled. "We need to talk." "Of course. Come in." They followed me to the living room, the same space where this had all begun just 4 days ago. But the dynamic had shifted completely. Where Jason had once stood confidently now, he perched on the edge of the sofa like he was ready to bolt. Amber sat beside him, her eyes darting around the room as if she was cataloging items for potential value. "I've brought my lawyer," Jason announced, trying to reclaim some authority. "He'll be here tomorrow morning. We're going to contest the trust documents." "That's certainly your right," I said pleasantly, settling into my favorite chair. "Though I should warn you that legal challenges to properly executed trusts rarely succeed, especially when there's 30 years of documentation supporting their validity." Amber leaned forward, her composure finally cracking completely. "You can't do this to us, Evelyn. We have a life planned. We have commitments. I quit my job at the hospital because Jason said we'd be set for life." "You quit your job?" I raised an eyebrow. "How presumptuous of you." "We bought a house," Jason said quietly. "Based on the expected sale price, the down payment is due next week." "That does sound like a problem," I agreed. Poor financial planning often leads to such difficulties. Jason's careful control slipped. "Stop playing games. You know what you've done. You've stolen what rightfully belongs to me." "Have I?" I pulled out a manila folder from the side table beside my chair. "Let's review what rightfully belonged to you, shall we?" I opened the folder and spread several documents across the coffee table. Jason and Amber leaned forward, squinting at the legal text. "This is your father's will," I said, pointing to the first document. "As you can see, he left you the family business as it was legally constituted at the time of his death. That included the corporate name, the office lease, the employee contracts, and the domestic client relationships." Jason grabbed the document, scanning it frantically. It says, "I inherit his share of Harrison Industries, which was 60% of the company." Correct. 60% of Harrison Industries as it existed 3 years ago. I pulled out another document. "However, this is the amendment your father signed 18 months before his death, formally acknowledging that the most valuable assets had been transferred to separate entities in which he held no ownership stake." "That's impossible," Amber said, snatching the paper. "Richard wouldn't have signed away his own assets. Richard didn't sign away anything I corrected." Richard acknowledged what had always been true, that those assets were mine to begin with. I was the one who developed the patents, negotiated the international contracts, and purchased the commercial properties. They were never his to leave to anyone. I watched Jason's face as the reality sank in. His expression cycled through confusion, anger, and finally a kind of hollow understanding. "You planned this from the beginning," he whispered. I protected what I built. I said just as any smart business person would. Jason stood up abruptly and began pacing. No, this is more than that. You let me believe I was inheriting a multi-million-dollar company. You watched me make plans, make commitments, quit my job to focus on running the business full-time. You set me up to fail. I gave you exactly what your father left you, I said calmly. If you chose to make assumptions about the value without doing proper due diligence, that's not my responsibility. Due diligence. Jason's voice cracked. You're my mother. I trusted you. Did you? Because from where I sit, it looks like you trusted that I was too stupid and too grief-stricken to notice what you were planning. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a voice recording I'd saved from 8 months ago. Jason's voice filled the room, tiny but clear from the phone's small speaker. Amber. I'm telling you, she has no idea what she's sitting on. Mom thinks the company is worth maybe $3 million tops. She's always been clueless about the financials. Once I convince her to sell, we'll have enough to buy that house in Cherry Creek and still have millions left over. The old lady will be so grateful for our help, she'll probably give us power of attorney over her personal accounts, too. The recording continued for another 30 seconds, with Jason laughing about how easy it would be to manipulate his scattered mother into making decisions that would benefit him. Amber's face went white. Where did you get that? Jason made that call from your kitchen last December when I was visiting for your housewarming party. You'd stepped out to get wine, and Jason thought I was in the bathroom. I was actually right around the corner holding my phone. Jason sank back onto the sofa, his head in his hands. You've been recording us. I've been protecting myself, I corrected. Something I learned to do during 42 years of being underestimated by men who thought they were smarter than me. I pulled out another phone and played a second recording. This one from Jason's conversation with his father, just 6 months before Richard's death. Dad, I'm worried about Mom. She seems confused about basic business concepts lately. Maybe it's time to start transitioning her into more of an advisory role. Let me handle the day-to-day operations before she makes a mistake that costs us everything. Richard's response was crystal clear. Son, your mother has forgotten more about business than you've learned yet. If you think she's confused, you're not paying attention. She's been running circles around competitors half her age while you've been focused on the office politics. Jason's voice on the recording became petulant. I just think fresh perspectives might be valuable. Some of her ideas seem pretty outdated. Richard's laugh was audible even through the phone's small speaker. Jason, your mother closed a $2.5 million international deal last week while you were complaining about the coffee in the break room. Maybe worry less about her perspectives and more about developing your own. When the recording ended, Jason looked physically ill. Amber was staring at him with an expression of dawning horror. You told me she was losing her mind, she said slowly. You said the doctors were concerned about early dementia. I never said that, Jason protested weakly. You absolutely said that. Amber's voice was getting louder. You said that's why we needed to act quickly before she made decisions that would hurt the family finances. I cleared my throat. There were never any doctor's concerns about dementia. My last cognitive assessment done as part of my annual physical 5 months ago showed no signs of any mental decline whatsoever. I can provide you with the medical records if you'd like. Amber turned to stare at Jason with a look of pure disgust. You lied to me about everything. I didn't lie, Jason said desperately. I was trying to protect our future. Mom's getting older and I thought... You thought you could steal from your own mother and convince your wife it was for her own good? I finished. The question now is what you're planning to do next. Jason looked around the room like a trapped animal. I'll contest the trust. I'll hire the best lawyers in Colorado. I'll prove that you manipulated Dad when he was sick. With what money? I asked reasonably. Your cards don't work. Remember Frank paid for your plane tickets, but I doubt he's prepared to fund a prolonged legal battle against trusts that have been properly maintained for 3 decades. I'll figure something out. You could, I agreed. Or you could accept reality and decide what kind of relationship you want to have going forward. Amber stood up abruptly. I'm not staying for this, Jason. Fix this or I'm done. I didn't marry someone who would lie to me about millions of dollars and then lose it all through sheer stupidity. She stormed toward the front door, her heels clicking angrily against the hardwood floor. Jason started to follow her, then stopped and turned back to me. What do you want from me? He asked, his voice broken. I want you to decide whether you love me or just what you thought I could give you, I said quietly. Because one of those relationships has a future, and one of them doesn't. Jason stared at me for a long moment, then walked out without another word. Through the window, I watched him and Amber have what appeared to be a vicious argument beside their rental car. She got in on the passenger side, slammed the door, and they drove away. My phone rang 20 minutes later. Jason's number. Mom, I need a place to stay tonight. Amber threw me out of the hotel. The spare room is available, I said. The rent is $50 a night, and you'll need to help with housework. $50? Mom, I don't have $50. Then I guess you'd better start figuring out how to earn some. There was a long pause. Are you really going to make me homeless? I'm going to let you experience what independence looks like when you don't have a safety net, I said. Consider it an education in personal responsibility. I'm your son. Yes, I said, and it's time you learned what that actually means. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen making coffee for two, a routine that had become as natural as breathing. The morning sun streamed through windows that sparkled. Jason had cleaned them yesterday as part of his weekly responsibilities. The house had never looked better or felt more peaceful. Good morning, Mom. Jason appeared in the doorway dressed in jeans and a simple button-down shirt, his hair still damp from the shower. The designer suits were long gone, sold months ago to help pay for basic necessities. Good morning. How did you sleep? Better than I have in years, actually. He moved to the cabinet and pulled out 2 mugs, a gesture that had become automatic. I finished reviewing the quarterly reports last night. The German partnership is exceeding projections by 20%. I smiled, handing him his coffee black the way he'd learned to drink it when expensive coffee makers and fancy creamers were no longer in the budget. And the Tokyo expansion, the contracts should be finalized by the end of the month. Your instincts about the market timing were perfect. It had taken Jason 3 months to stop being bitter about working for his mother instead of inheriting her company. It had taken another 2 months for him to realize that he was actually learning more about business than he ever had when he thought he was entitled to success. The transformation hadn't been easy or pretty. After Amber left him at the hotel that night, Jason had spent 2 weeks sleeping on friends' couches, trying to borrow money for lawyers to contest the trust. One by one, his friends had stopped returning his calls when they realized he had no way to pay them back. Frank had refused to fund a legal battle after Richard's lawyer confirmed that the trust documents were airtight. Jason had finally shown up on my doorstep 3 weeks later, exhausted and humbled, asking if my offer of the spare room was still available. I'll pay the $50 a night, he'd said, standing on the porch with a single suitcase. And I'll do the housework. I just need somewhere to stay while I figure out what comes next. What comes next is up to you, I told him. But if you're staying here, you follow my rules. The rules had been simple but non-negotiable. No drinking, no drugs, no overnight guests without permission, rent paid weekly in advance, household chores assigned and completed without complaint. Most importantly, if he wanted to be part of the family business again, he would start at the bottom and work his way up based on merit, not bloodline. I have a meeting with the Benson Group this afternoon, I said now, settling at the kitchen table with my coffee. Would you like to sit in? Jason's eyes lit up. Really? They're one of our biggest potential clients. They're also notoriously difficult to work with. I thought you might learn something from watching how to handle demanding customers. 6 months ago, Jason would have bristled at the suggestion that he needed to learn anything. Now he nodded eagerly. I'd appreciate that. Should I prepare anything in advance? Review their file study, their previous partnerships, think about why they might be hesitant to work with us, and how we might address those concerns. Already done, Jason said, pulling out a notebook filled with his handwriting. I stayed up until midnight researching their corporate culture and recent market challenges. I felt a familiar warmth in my chest. The same feeling I'd had when Jason was 8 years old and had spent hours building an elaborate Lego castle determined to get every detail perfect. Somewhere along the way, I'd lost that focused, determined child. I was grateful to see glimpses of him returning. Jason, I said carefully, I want you to know that I'm proud of how hard you've been working. He looked up from his notebook surprised. You are? I am. When you first came back, I wasn't sure if you were here because you genuinely wanted to change, or just because you had nowhere else to go. Honestly, at first, it was because I had nowhere else to go. Jason's face reddened slightly. I spent those weeks on couches planning how I was going to prove you wrong, how I was going to get back what I thought was mine. It took me a while to realize that what I thought was mine was never really mine to begin with. And now, Jason set down his coffee cup and looked directly at me. Now I realize that I wasted the first 36 years of my life trying to live up to an image of Dad that wasn't even real. I thought being a man meant taking what I wanted and never asking for help. I thought strength meant never admitting when I was wrong. And what do you think now? I think Dad was successful because he was smart enough to marry someone smarter than him and humble enough to listen to her advice. Jason's voice was steady, serious. I think I missed out on 36 years of learning from the most capable person I know, because I was too arrogant to see past my own assumptions. The conversation was interrupted by the ringing of my phone. The caller ID showed a number I hadn't seen in months. Amber. Jason saw the name on the screen and tensed. Are you going to answer it? I'm curious what she wants after all this time. I accepted the call. Hello, Amber. Evelyn, hi. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. Her voice was different, smaller, somehow less confident than I remembered. It's fine. What can I do for you? I was wondering, is Jason there? I've been trying to reach him, but his number's been disconnected. I glanced at Jason, who was shaking his head vigorously. He's here. Would you like to speak with him? Actually, I was hoping to speak with you first. I have something I need to say. Jason raised his eyebrows but didn't object when I put the phone on speaker. I owe you an apology, Amber continued, a big one. I was wrong about you, and I was wrong to encourage Jason to do what he did. What changed your mind? I asked. Life, she said with a bitter laugh. After I left Jason in Denver, I moved back in with my parents. I've been job hunting for 6 months, and let me tell you, it's humbling. I forgot what it was like to actually work for things instead of just expecting them to be handed to me. I see. I also had time to think about our marriage, about the person I was when I was with Jason. I didn't like that person very much. I was entitled and greedy and completely comfortable with the idea of taking advantage of someone who'd done nothing but love and support their child. Jason was staring at the phone with an expression I couldn't quite read. I called to apologize to you, Amber continued, but also to tell Jason something important. The divorce papers are being filed this week. I'm not asking for anything except my personal belongings. I don't deserve anything more than that. Amber, Jason said quietly. You don't have to. Yes, I do, Jason. You made mistakes, but I made them worse. I pushed you to see your mother as an obstacle instead of an ally. I convinced you that taking advantage of her was somehow justified. I'm ashamed of who I was, and I'm sorry. After she hung up, Jason and I sat in silence for several minutes. How do you feel? I asked finally. Relieved, he said without hesitation. Sad, but relieved. The person I was when I was married to Amber wasn't someone I liked very much either. And now, Jason looked around the kitchen at the simple breakfast we'd shared at the honest work waiting for both of us. Now I feel like maybe I'm becoming someone Dad would have been proud of. Your father was always proud of you, I said gently. He just wanted you to be proud of yourself too. That afternoon's meeting with the Benson group went better than I'd hoped. Jason asked intelligent questions, took detailed notes, and offered insights that showed he'd really done his homework. When they asked about our succession planning, I was able to point to Jason as our Director of Operations, a title he'd earned through 6 months of 60-hour weeks and flawless performance. After the clients left, Jason and I sat in the conference room, reviewing the notes. I think they're going to sign, he said, organizing his papers. I think so too. That was excellent work today. Jason smiled, but then his expression grew serious. Mom, can I ask you something? Of course. When you were setting up the trust structures, when you were protecting the assets from me, did you know it would end up like this with me working for you, learning the business properly? I considered the question carefully. I hoped it would, but I was prepared for the possibility that you'd walk away forever and never speak to me again. What would you have done then? I would have run the company myself until I couldn't anymore, then sold it to someone who would take care of our employees. I paused. But I would have missed you every day for the rest of my life. Jason's eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry I put you through that. I'm sorry I made you feel like you had to choose between protecting yourself and protecting me. You didn't make me choose, I said. You made a choice about what kind of son you wanted to be. I just made sure that choice had real consequences. And if I'd chosen differently, if I'd kept fighting you in court, then you would have learned that respect can't be inherited or stolen. It can only be earned. Jason nodded slowly. I think I'm finally starting to understand that. As we packed up to leave the office, Jason turned to me one more time. Mom, thank you. For what? For not giving up on me. For showing me who I could become instead of just accepting who I was. I smiled, thinking about the long journey that had brought us to this moment. That's what mothers do, Jason. We love you enough to let you fail, and we love you enough to help you succeed. Even when your children call you a burden, especially then, I said, because that's when they need us most. 6 months ago, I'd thought I was losing my son. Instead, I'd found him, the real him, underneath all the entitlement and assumptions the man Richard and I had always hoped he'd become. It had taken losing everything for Jason to discover what actually mattered. And it had taken risking everything for me to save the relationship that mattered most. As we walked out of the office together, I realized that this was what victory actually looked like. Not the moment you prove you're right, but the moment everyone finally understands what was worth fighting for. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.